The intake counter at Doran Weapons Services had a specific organizational logic that Kael had developed over 9 years of contract maintenance work. Weapons in the left intake tray, documentation in the right intake tray, and the 3 centimeter gap between them that existed, because he had learned, early and specifically, that documentation adjacent to weapons in active maintenance created the kind of confusion that produced expensive errors. He was organized in the particular way of someone who worked alone and therefore had no one to blame for disorganization except himself, and who had found this accountability clarifying rather than burdensome. The Vethori woman put the blade in the center of the counter, not the left intake tray. The center of the counter, which was where clients put things when they were not paying attention to the tray system, which happened often enough that he had stopped treating it as information about the client and had simply developed the habit of moving things to the appropriate tray after intake. He reached for the blade to move it. He did not move it. He had been doing this work for 9 years and had developed the specific, immediate assessment reflex that long-term craftsmen developed, the first-second inventory of a new piece, the automatic registration of what it was before the formal assessment began. The reflex fired and produced results he did not immediately know what to do with, so he left the blade on the center of the counter and looked at it for a moment while the woman provided the verbal intake. Damaged in field engagement, she said. Molecular edge compromised, balance off from prior repair work. Functional status, standard rate 3 weeks. He looked at her. She was Vethori, which he knew from the mercenary company's contract roster, and she had the clipped efficiency of someone who processed service providers as a category and did not distinguish within the category. She was looking at the documentation tablet with the expectation of an intake confirmation. "Can I ask how old the blade is?" he said. "Does it affect the repair?" she said. "It affects the approach," he said. She looked at the blade. "Old," she said, in the tone of someone who had never been asked this and was not certain the information was hers to quantify. "It has been in my family for several generations." "Do you know the original maker?" "No," she said. "The records from that period are incomplete." He looked at the blade. He had not touched it yet. Touching came after intake, after the client was gone, after the formal assessment began. But he had been looking at it since she put it on the counter, and the looking had been doing its work without him directing it. The old of the blade was not the old of neglect or simple age. It was the old of something that had been made at a level of craft that communicated itself even through damage, the specific, residual quality of significant work that persisted even when the work had been compromised. 3 weeks, functional status, standard rate, he said. "Correct," she said. He completed the intake confirmation. She paid the deposit with the efficiency of someone paying for a routine service and left before he had finished the confirmation script, which happened with clients who had long lists and did not distinguish within the service provider category. He stood at the counter for a moment after she left. Then he moved the blade to the assessment workbench, which was where the serious work began, and he turned on the full-spectrum lighting, and he looked at what he had. The assessment took 4 hours, which was longer than standard assessment by approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes, and produced a document that was longer than his standard assessment documents by approximately 6 pages. The blade was not what the intake description had described. The intake description had been accurate. The molecular edge was compromised. The balance was off from the prior repair work. Functional status was the appropriate contracted objective. These things were true. They were also the surface of a situation that had considerably more depth than the surface. He had been working with exotic armaments long enough to have a reference library of Vethori weapons documentation, which was the academic end of the field, and which he had read with the thorough interest he brought to all metallurgical traditions. The academic literature on Vethori blade-making described, in the careful language of researchers who had studied the tradition from the outside, 2 distinct periods. The classical period, characterized by techniques that the literature noted had not been replicated in modern production and were understood primarily through surviving examples, and the contemporary period, which produced functional weapons of competent construction through methods that were documented and teachable, and were not the same methods as the classical period. The blade on his workbench was classical period. The literature had told him classical period work had a specific quality he would recognize if he ever saw it. He was seeing it. The compromised molecular edge was compromised in the way of something that had been extraordinary before compromise. The geometry of the original treatment still partially legible under the damage. The specific angulature of a technique that the contemporary literature described as theoretically reconstructed from blade analysis, but not known to have been reproduced. The prior repair work had been done by someone competent in contemporary methods, using contemporary materials, which had restored function at the cost of the integral design. The balance philosophy of the original work was not something the repair had known to preserve, because the balance philosophy was not in the contemporary documentation. He looked at the secondary patterning on the flat of the blade. The contemporary literature described it as decorative. He had always found this characterization insufficient, because decorative elements in serious weapons traditions were rarely merely decorative, and this pattern had a geometry that was too precise and too internally consistent for ornamentation. He had noted this in his reading and filed it as a gap in the available documentation and moved on, because moving on was what you did with gaps in the documentation when you did not have the primary sources to fill them. He looked at his options. He could complete the contracted work in the contracted time, repair the molecular edge to functional status using contemporary methods, correct the balance as much as the prior repair work permitted, return the weapon in 3 weeks at standard rate. This was the contract. This was what had been asked for. He looked at the blade. He opened the Xenocultural Metallurgy Literature database and began reading with the specific, focused attention of someone who had found a gap in the documentation and had decided that the gap was going to require more than the academic literature to cross. The document in the Solon Prime Cultural Archive was held in the physical collection under a classification designation that translated, approximately, as technical documentation, craftsman origin, Vethori, pre-contemporary period. The librarian who responded to his digitization request sent 17 images and a note that said she had been hoping someone would ask for this particular document for quite some time and was glad it had found its way to someone who knew what it was. He was not certain he knew what it was until he had been reading it for an hour. The handwriting was Vethori script in a form that predated the contemporary standardization, which meant it required the archaic language reference to read, and which meant the reading was slow and deliberate, and gave him time to absorb each section before moving to the next. This was not inconvenient. The content deserved slow and deliberate. The master smith's name was in the opening pages, a formal self-identification that the academic literature had listed as one of the classical period's significant practitioners, and had been unable to further document because the primary sources were apparently all in a physical archive on Solon Prime waiting for someone to ask for them. The notes were not a manual. They were the documentation of a living tradition by someone who understood that the tradition was not going to survive in living form and was trying to give it a different kind of survival. They described the work the way a practitioner described it, from the inside, with the assumptions of someone writing for an audience who would understand the context, which meant the audience he had written for no longer existed, and which meant reading the notes required Kael to reconstruct the context from the technical details, which was the kind of reading he had spent 9 years getting good at. The molecular edge treatment was described in terms of geometric relationships that he spent 2 days translating into the metallurgical framework his training had given him. When the translation completed, he sat with it for a while and then went to his materials reference and found that the specific alloy combination the notes described was achievable with contemporary materials in a ratio that was not in the contemporary literature, but that the notes specified with the precision of someone who had worked it out empirically and was not guessing. The balance philosophy took 3 days to understand, not because it was obscure, but because it was specific in the way of things that were specific to a body. The Vethori warrior's body, the way it moved in combat, the specific geometry of the species' reach and grip and cutting motion that the blade was designed to extend rather than equip. He had Vethori physiology documentation from the mercenary company's technical files, which he had filed as background reference when the contract started, and had not anticipated needing at this level of detail. He read it carefully, and then read the master smith's balance notes again with the physiology documentation in the adjacent window, and the philosophy resolved into something he could work with, which was a specific weight distribution across the blade that was not the contemporary standard, and was not what the prior repair work had produced, and was what the blade had been before it was damaged. The secondary patterning was the last section of the notes. He read it and then put down everything he was holding and sat very still for a moment. The pattern was not decorative. The pattern was a stress redistribution architecture, a technique that used the geometry of the surface pattern to create differential flex characteristics across the flat of the blade, allowing the weapon to absorb impact forces that would fracture a uniformly rigid blade, and to redistribute those forces through the structure in a way that preserved the edge geometry under combat loading. It was, in the terms of contemporary metallurgical engineering, a sophisticated structural solution that the contemporary literature had described as decorative, because no one reading the contemporary literature had understood what it was. The notes described it with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone for whom the technique was known and teachable, and included the geometric specifications for the pattern at the full blade length. He cleared the rest of his schedule for the next 2 weeks and began. The work was the work, and the story does not need to inflate it with drama it did not contain. It was 3 weeks of careful, sustained attention to a specific object in the light of everything that had been learned about it, which was more than had been known about it when it arrived. It was the molecular edge treatment in the alloy ratio the notes specified, applied in the geometry the notes described, which required the fabrication of a tool he did not have because contemporary practice had not needed the tool, and the tool's specifications were in the notes. It was the balance correction to the philosophy the notes articulated, which required removing the prior repair work and returning the blade to the condition where the original balance architecture was legible, and then building from there, which was not the approach the contracted scope had described, and which was the only approach that was honest to the blade. It was the secondary patterning restored to the specifications in the notes, applied with the controlled precision of someone who understood what each line of the pattern was doing structurally, and was therefore not guessing about the depth or angle of any element. It was, at the end of 3 weeks, a blade that was restored to a specification Kael had reconstructed from primary sources and executed in contemporary materials using the techniques those sources described, and which was, in his assessment, which he was careful not to overstate because overstatement was for people who were not confident in their work, the closest achievable approximation of what the blade had been before the damage. He was not certain it was correct. He had no living tradition to check against. He had 17 images and his own metallurgical judgment and 3 weeks of work, and the result was what those 3 things produced. He put the blade on the presentation cloth. He looked at it. He had put significant work on the presentation cloth before. He had done restoration work that he was proud of, in the plain way of a craftsman being satisfied with the outcome of a difficult job. He had never put something on the presentation cloth that made him feel specifically and quietly certain that the work was the best thing he had done in 9 years, which was the feeling he had looking at the blade on the cloth, which he noted and did not perform, and went home to get a reasonable amount of sleep before the pickup. She arrived exactly on schedule, which was consistent with everything else about her. He had the blade on the presentation cloth on the counter. He had the master smith's documentation in a folder beside it, the 17 archive images, his translation notes, the material specifications he had developed, the fabrication documentation for the custom tool. He had prepared a handover script, because he always prepared a handover script for significant work, covering the restoration approach and the sources and the specific decisions that had been made and why. She came through the door with the same clipped efficiency as the drop-off. She gave the pickup confirmation number. She held out her hand. He presented the blade. He had been watching clients receive significant work for 9 years and had developed the ability to read the reception. The range of responses from the perfunctory to the genuinely moved, the specific ways that people received objects that mattered to them. He thought he had seen the range. He had not seen this. The rigidity arrived in the first second, and it was not the controlled rigidity of someone managing a reaction. It was the involuntary rigidity of a body that had been given information it did not have a prepared response for, and had stopped all non-essential processing to concentrate everything on the processing it could not defer. He had read about Vethori emotional overload in the cultural briefing that the mercenary contract included, and he recognized the threat display, the chromatic spike at the neck and upper torso, the specific physiological signature of extreme emotional load, and he understood from the briefing that the display in this context was not threat but maximum alert, the body reaching for its highest amplitude response, because nothing smaller had the capacity for what it was trying to express. The blade left her hands, not thrown, not dropped, released in the specific, passive way of hands that had redirected their neural resources to something that was not grip, and could not be asked to maintain grip while the redirect was happening. He was around the counter before it reached the floor, which was faster than he had moved in some time, and he caught it in the presentation cloth because the presentation cloth was still in his hands, and it was the appropriate material for the blade, and the concrete floor was not. He held the blade and looked at her. She was standing with the absolute rigidity and the chromatic display and the specific, devastated expression of someone who was trying to process multiple things simultaneously and was not succeeding, and who was aware of not succeeding, and who had no available tool for the gap between what she was experiencing and what she had the capacity to express. He did not say anything. He had been doing this work for 9 years, and he understood that there were moments when saying something was the wrong action, and this was one of them. He held the blade in the presentation cloth and waited. She found the client chair in the way of someone whose legs had made a decision her cognition had not caught up with yet and sat in it. He put the blade on the counter where she could see it. He got water, because water was what he had, and he set it on the counter near the blade and went back to his side of the counter and waited. The rigidity faded the way the physiological response faded when the immediate load eased, not quickly, not completely, but in the specific, gradual way of a system coming back to functional from overloaded. She looked at the blade. She was still looking at it in the specific way that she had looked at it when her hand stopped working, the full, complete attention of someone who was seeing something they had not expected to see, and was still in the process of understanding what they were seeing. How, she said. It was not the first word of a longer sentence. It was the complete question. He told her. He told it in the order it happened, the assessment that had produced the first indication, the literature that had provided the framework, the archive document, and the librarian who had been waiting. He put the folder on the counter and showed her the 17 images, which she looked at with an expression. He did not have a cultural reference for except that it was the expression of someone looking at something they had not expected to see in a form they had not expected to see it. He told her about the master smith's documentation and what it had described, and what that had let him understand about the blade. He told her about the 3 weeks, which was the contracted time, and which was also not fully the contracted time. And he was accurate about this, because accuracy was what the situation called for, and evasion would have been a form of dishonesty he was not willing to perform. She looked at the folder, she looked at the blade, she looked at him. "You worked past the contracted scope," she said, "on your own time." "The contracted scope was functional restoration," he said. "That was achievable in the first week. What I found in the assessment was that functional restoration was not the only restoration available, and the documentation suggested the other restoration was possible." And he stopped. He looked at the blade which was on the counter in the presentation cloth, and he thought about how to say what was actually true. "The work required it," he said. "The blade required it. I don't know how to explain that more specifically than that." She was quiet for a long time. She picked up the blade carefully, with both hands, in the specific way of someone who had reestablished the grip function, and was not taking it for granted, and she held it in the way he had not seen her hold it at drop-off. At drop-off she had held it like a damaged item being transferred. She was holding it now like something she was in a conversation with. "My family's records describe this blade," she said. "Not by name. We do not have the maker's name, which you have apparently found." She looked at the archival images. "The records describe a blade that was made at a level we were told was mythological exaggeration. That the original specifications described in the family histories were the kind of thing families told themselves to make the loss of what it had been easier to carry." She held the blade in the light and looked at the secondary patterning. "I was told the pattern was decorative, by my company's weapons specialist, by the smith who did the field repair, by everyone who looked at it." "It is not decorative," he said. "No," she said. "What you told me it is the stress redistribution. I can feel it, holding it now. The way it sits in the hand is different from how it sat before. The balance is—" She stopped. "The balance is what the family records described, which I read as exaggeration. The master smith's notes include the balance specifications," he said. "The notes are very specific." She looked at the archival images again. She looked at them with the specific, halting attention of someone working from the edges of a language. They knew toward the center of a version they did not. And he watched her read and did not interrupt, because she was reading something significant in the specific way, and interruption was wrong. "This script," she said, "this is pre-standardization." "Yes," he said. "The contemporary reference helped with the archaic forms. The technical vocabulary was the harder part. You translated this." "I needed to understand the technique," he said. "The translation was how I understood it." She set the archival images down. She held the blade with both hands and looked at it for a long time in the quiet of his workshop, which held the specific quality of a space where significant work had been done, and the significance had not yet fully settled into the ordinary life of the space. "My family has carried this blade for 6 generations," she said. 5 of those generations carried it damaged, because the damage happened 200 years ago, and the person who would have known how to restore it was dead before they could teach anyone." She paused. "My grandmother told me the blade was important. She could not tell me specifically why, because she had inherited it already damaged and had never seen it as it was supposed to be. She told me to keep it because families kept such things and because there might be a time when someone understood it." She looked at him. She meant a Vethori smith. She meant someone from our tradition. She did not mean a human contractor on Verath Station, he said. "Yes," she said. "She did not mean that." "I had the documentation," he said, "and the time, and the work was—" He stopped. "The work was what it was. I don't know how to explain it differently." She was quiet again. She was looking at the blade with the expression he was still learning to read. Not the catalogued expressions of a cultural briefing document, but the specific expressions of a specific person, which required time and context, and could not be borrowed from documentation. What he read in it was the complicated quality of someone who had been carrying something damaged for a long time, and had arrived at the moment where it was not damaged, and who was processing what that meant for everything she had believed about what it could be. The documentation, she said, the archive images, your translation notes. They are yours, he said. I made copies for my records with your permission. The originals are yours. She looked at him. You kept copies. For the project documentation, he said. And because, he thought about how to say it, because the techniques in those notes are not in the contemporary literature. The stress redistribution architecture is not documented anywhere in the accessible metallurgical record. I would like to write about it if you are willing to permit that, because the technique should be in the literature. She was quiet for a moment. You want to publish the Smith's notes? I want to write about the technique, he said, with attribution to the Smith, whose name we now have. And with your permission, because the blade is how I learned it was achievable, and the blade belongs to your family. She looked at the archival images. The 17 pages of a master smith documenting a tradition he had understood was going to need documentation to survive, writing for an audience who no longer existed, which had turned out to mean writing for an audience he could not have predicted. He was writing so someone would be able to read it, she said. Yes, Kael said, and someone did. Yes, he said. She folded the archival images into the folder with the careful, specific attention of someone putting something important somewhere appropriate. She held the blade. She stood. I would like to bring you the rest of my family's records, she said. Regarding the blade, there is documentation from each generation that carried it, not technical mostly, account of use. Who carried it and where, what was done with it. She looked at the blade, then at him. The Smith's notes should be accompanied by the blade's history. If you are going to write about the technique, the record should include both. Yes, he said, it should. I will bring the records, she said. When I return from the current deployment, 3 weeks. I will be here, he said. She moved toward the door. She stopped. The standard rate, she said, was what was contracted, he said. Was not what was delivered, she said. The contracted work is what the rate covers, he said. The additional work was not what I asked for, she said. What you decided the blade required. She looked at him with the full, direct attention she had been giving the blade and was now giving him, which had the specific quality of being seen by someone who had recently revised what seeing meant and was applying the revision. That is not a reason to not pay for it. That is a reason to pay for it more carefully. She put a figure on the intake counter that was not the figure he would have invoiced if he had been invoicing additional work, which was more than 3 times the standard rate. For the technique documentation, she said, and the translation, and the tool fabrication, and the 3 weeks. He looked at the figure. That is more than. Yes, she said, it is. She looked at the blade one more time. The blade that was whole. That was what it was supposed to be, that had been restored to the specification of a master smith, whose name they now had and whose notes had survived in a physical archive for 300 years, waiting for the right kind of attention. My grandmother said there would be a time when someone understood it. She paused at the door. She was right. She did not know about the time or the someone, but she was right. She left. He stood in the workshop for a while in the specific, unhurried quality of someone who has done significant work and is on the other side of it, looking at the empty presentation cloth and the figure on the intake counter and the folder of archival images that was his copy, which was the record of a tradition that was going to be in the literature now, because a master smith had written it down for an audience he could not predict, and the audience had eventually arrived. He filed the project documentation. He noted the scope accurately, contracted work completed on schedule, restoration work completed on personal time, technique documentation initiated pending family records review. He filed it. He opened a new document and put the master smith's name at the top and began to write.